never had any links to drug trafficking. I
have always assured you that my money has no links to drug trafficking.
When Pablo Escobar was killed on a rooftop in Medellin on December 2nd, 1993, the world treated it as an ending. People celebrated in the streets of Bogota. News anchors called it the collapse of the world's most violent drug empire. But for the three people who had shared his home, it wasn't an ending at all. It was the start of the most dangerous chapter of their lives. His wife, Maria Victoria Henao, and his two children, 16-year-old Juan Pablo and 9-year-old Manuela, went from living inside the protection of one of the richest and most feared men on earth to being hunted the moment he stopped breathing. Henao had met Escobar when she was just 12 years old and married him a few years later, in 1976, becoming his only wife and staying by his side through the entire arc of his rise and fall. By the time of his death, she had spent nearly 2 decades inside a world of extraordinary wealth and extraordinary violence. When Escobar was killed, every debt he'd built up with rival cartels, paramilitary groups, and the Colombian state came due at once, and there was no longer anyone left to answer for it but his family. Reports at the time suggested a bounty of several $1 million had effectively been placed on his son's life. Juan Pablo made things worse for himself that same night, appearing on Colombian radio and vowing to hunt down the people responsible for his father's death, a threat that, in a world built on cycles of retaliation, was itself an invitation to be killed. Within days, the family understood there was no safe place left for them in Colombia and fled the country. What followed was a desperate, humiliating search for anywhere that would take them in. According to multiple accounts, they sought asylum in Germany and were turned away. They tried Mozambique, a country still rebuilding after its own civil war, and were refused there too. Other reporting places additional stops on that journey, including Brazil, though accounts vary on the exact list of countries and the order in which they tried them. What's consistent across nearly every source is the outcome. Nation after nation looked at the Escobar name and closed the door, treating a widow and 2 children who had never been convicted of anything as though they were the danger themselves. It wasn't until late 1994 that the family finally found a country willing to let them stay, entering Argentina on tourist visas and settling in Buenos Aires. Staying meant disappearing. The family adopted entirely new identities to survive, and now began going by names including Maria Isabel Santos Caballero, and at other points, Victoria Henao Vallejos. Juan Pablo became Juan Sebastian Marroquin Santos, a name he later shortened publicly to Sebastian Marroquin. Manuela took the name Juana Manuela Marroquin Santos. For years, it worked. Neighbors in their Buenos Aires apartment complex remember an unremarkable family. A teenage girl attending an ordinary school, a young man trying to piece together some version of a future, a mother managing whatever modest resources they had left. It was about as far as it was possible to get from the private zoo, armed convoys, and staff of servants that had defined their life in Colombia. Contrary to the popular assumption that the family quietly lived off hidden cartel fortunes, most credible reporting suggests they left Colombia with only a small fraction of what people believed Escobar controlled. His visible assets were seized, abandoned, or destroyed. The Monaco building in Medellin, the fortress-like apartment complex where the family had once lived, was bombed by the rival Cali cartel in a 1988 assassination attempt, seized by the government afterward, and ultimately demolished by the city in 2019 to make way for a memorial to Escobar's victims. Hacienda Napoles, his sprawling countryside estate complete with a private zoo of imported elephants, giraffes, and hippos, descendants of which still roam wild in the Colombian countryside today, was lost to the government in a lengthy legal battle and eventually converted into a public theme park with a museum dedicated to his victims. Whatever fortune outsiders imagined the family was still sitting on, the reality was closer to having to rebuild an entire financial life from near zero. That perception gap followed them into real legal trouble. In 1999, an anonymous tip led Argentine authorities to Henao's true identity, and she and Sebastian, then in his early 20s, were arrested on suspicion of money laundering and using falsified documents. The case drew international headlines. The family the world assumed had vanished was suddenly exposed and facing prison in a foreign country. After more than a year of investigation, prosecutors found insufficient evidence, and both were released. Henao told reporters afterward that she believed she'd been targeted simply for who she had been married to rather than for anything she'd actually done, reportedly saying she was being made a prisoner in Argentina for being Colombian. It would not be the last time. In 2018, Argentine authorities arrested Henao and her son again, this time alongside former Colombian footballer Mauricio Serna, accusing all three of acting as intermediaries to launder money for a Colombian drug trafficker through real estate and a Buenos Aires tango cafe. Decades after fleeing Colombia, specifically to escape that world, the family found the same accusations following them regardless. Of the two children, Manuela's story remains the most closely guarded. She was only 9 when her father died, old enough to remember fragments of an almost unbelievable childhood, including a widely repeated story that when she asked her father for a unicorn, Escobar reportedly had staff attach a horn and makeshift wings to a horse in an attempt to make it real. That world vanished for her overnight. She grew up under her assumed name in Buenos Aires, attending school and living quietly, and Colombian journalists tracked pieces of her life as far as 1999. Since then, virtually nothing has surfaced. There are no confirmed interviews, no verified public appearances, and no known social media presence tied to her real identity. What little has been reported secondhand suggests she has stayed in Buenos Aires and has some involvement in a small real estate venture connected to her mother, but by every available account, she has chosen total, deliberate silence as the way she protects whatever life she has built. Her brother took the opposite path. Sebastian spent his first years in Argentina, keeping just as low a profile as his sister, eventually studying architecture at the University of Palermo in Buenos Aires and building a small practice of his own, a profession he later said gave him a way of believing that something worthwhile could still be built after everything he'd known was torn down. For years, his colleagues and clients had no idea who he really was. That changed in 2009, when he agreed to take part in a documentary directed by Argentine filmmaker Nicholas Untold, released as Sins of My Father. Marroquin set 2 conditions before agreeing. His father's name couldn't appear in the title, and his sister could not be shown in it at all. The film's central moment came when Marroquin traveled to Bogotá to meet the sons of 2 men his father had ordered killed. Luis Carlos Galán, a presidential candidate assassinated in 1989, and Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, a former justice minister murdered years before that. Marroquin had reportedly written the families a letter asking for forgiveness before the meeting took place. Galán's son later said the letter felt genuinely sincere and that he considered Marroquin, too, a victim of what his father had done. The meeting didn't erase anything, but by the accounts of everyone involved, it marked a deliberate choice not to pass the cycle of vengeance down to yet another generation. The film premiered in Colombia and screened at the Sundance Film Festival, and from that point Marroquin stepped fully into public life, eventually writing a best-selling memoir and becoming a speaker on reconciliation. Henao stayed silent far longer. She said almost nothing publicly for over 2 decades, through exile, poverty, and 2 separate arrests. That changed with the 2019 release of her memoir, Mrs. Escobar, My Life with Pablo, which became a Sunday Times Book of the Year. In interviews tied to the book, she described a side of Escobar rarely shown in the endless dramatizations built around him, a young man, before cocaine money took over his ambitions, who spoke of building schools and helping the poor. She never denied what he became. She simply insisted her own memory of the man she'd actually married was more complicated than the version the world had settled on, and said she felt she owed her children and grandchildren an honest account from someone who had actually lived it. More than 3 decades after that rooftop in Medellin, the 3 of them remained split between visibility and total invisibility. Sebastian Marroquin still lives in Buenos Aires, still works in architecture, and continues speaking publicly about reconciliation, openly critical of dramatized portrayals of his father that he feels ignore the real cost to victims' families. Manuela, now in her 40s, remains almost entirely unseen, with no confirmed photographs or public statements in decades. And Henao, after years working quietly in real estate and cycling through arrests tied to a fortune she says she never truly controlled, has settled into a life partly defined by finally telling her own version of events, on her own terms, after decades of choosing silence instead. Their story doesn't match the myth that so often gets attached to the Escobar name. There was no secret fortune waiting for them, no easy landing anywhere in the world. What actually happened was years of rejected asylum applications, a jail cell in Buenos Aires, a demolished building back home, and a slow, ordinary rebuilding of 3 separate lives out of very little, under names that were never truly their own, carrying an inheritance none of them ever asked for.